Elohim means, what that name represents, the ability of God to conceal his infinite light, to give space for creation. So now that we mentioned the Tzimtsum, perhaps this is a good time to elaborate a little bit about the concept of Tzimtsum, because Tzimtsum, which literally means constraints, God holding back his infinite light and making space for another, is a very important concept in the Kabbalah. It's an important concept in Hasidic philosophy, and it's just a very fundamental concept, and it also fuels a lot of controversy and a lot of dispute. There's a lot to talk about the Tzimtzum. I want to talk about one aspect of it, and hopefully it would be interesting and maybe a little bit relevant. So let's think about this. Let's begin the journey. So again, if you go back to the Kabbalah, the original Kabbalist who discussed the idea of Tzimtzum is the Arizal. The Ari, Yitzchak Luria, living in Tzfat in Israel in the 16th century, introduces the concept of a Tzimtzum. And just to repeat what he says as follows. He says that in the beginning, when God created the world, there was only infinite light everywhere. Now, if you had infinite light everywhere, there could be no space for a universe. So what God has to do is God creates what the Arizal student Chaim Vital, who wrote his teachings. So he quotes his teacher, his master, the Arizal, who says, God creates a halal umakom panui, a cavity, an empty space, an empty hollow space where there is no infinite light of God. And then that within that space, there is the potential for the world to be created. The Arizal continues, afterward, God takes one little ray or one line of light and draws it back into the empty space. And that is called the kav, the line, scepter, the line of holiness that is now in the empty space. And that line is what we consider holiness. So if you do a mitzvah, really what you're doing is you're actually bringing a line of light from the infinite light back into the empty and hollow space. This is the Kabbalistic description of the process of Tzimtzum, which would allow for the creation. So I hope this sounds a little mystical, because it's supposed to be mystical. And if you give me a few minutes, we'll make it a little bit more mystical. And then we will go back, hopefully, to the more tangible, the actual reading of the Torah, and we'll see what we can make of this. You have to excuse me, because even though you came for a Torah class, it's really a mysticism class, because what the Mishnah calls the Ma'aseh Bereshis, the story of creation, is really very cryptic and very mystical. So even the practical commentators, when they come to the story of creation, they start talking a mysticism. So we have to follow suit. Okay, so let's get back to the Kabbalah. The Kabbalah says we're living in this empty space, empty and hollow space, because as a result of the Tzimtzum, as a result of God's removing, he is contracting himself and removing his infinite light. So we're in a space that's a vacuum, and there's no infinite light of God in the space, and this is where we live, and this is where we operate. Okay. Parenthetically, there's a whole discussion of whether or not we are living in an empty space. The Hasidim believe that we're not living in an empty space. We take the Arizal, we consider the Arizal's words to be non-literal, and we say that when the Arizal says we're living in an empty space, it means a space where we don't see the light, we don't feel the infinite light. But God's essence is still in that empty space. That's the Hasidic view. Other people read the Arizal literally, and they read that the Tzimtzum is literal, meaning to say there is a space without godliness, and therefore God is not everywhere. Now, this is not just a theoretical application, a theoretical discussion. This discussion had tremendous ramifications and actually fueled the historic dispute between the Hasidim and those who oppose the Hasidim, because the Baal Shem Tov said God is everywhere, and other people said that is heresy. And to support their proof, they brought the words of the Arizal, which says that there was a hollow and empty space void of the infinite light of God. So the Hasidim said a few things. First of all, they say the light is the Arizal is non-literal. It means it's concealed, not that it's not there. Another thing they say is that God's infinite light is absent, but God's essence is present. But that's another discussion. We're not going to go into the dispute between the Hasidim and the non-Hasidim, at least not right now, about the question of whether or not the Tzimtzum was literal. So for now, we're just going to say we're living in an empty space, an empty, hollow space where we don't see God's infinite light. We don't feel God's infinite light. And the way we connect to God is by that one line of holiness that God sort of redraws into the empty and hollow space. And every time we do a mitzvah, from the perspective of the Kabbalah, what you're really doing is you're giving an infusion of more light coming down through that one scepter, that one line of holiness. And that's the definition of holiness in this world, where something gets the light of God back that was sort of removed from the universe. And now is sort of outside the Tzimtzum, outside the empty and hollow space, and now it's moved back into the empty and hollow space. This is Kabbalah 101. We're not done yet, don't worry. So that's one place where you get holiness. If you're living in this world and you want to connect to holiness, the only way you do it, you have to draw down that line. Now that line is a whole story, what happens to that line. It's not so simple. That line forms all the worlds that we know. All the creative power of God is really that one line. So we have at least 4 spiritual worlds and many, many, many subworlds. So this line is a universe. But the point is, it's a finite expression of God's light, and that creates all the holiness and all the creative power that we see in this world. If I want a greater connection to God, I'm trying to bring down more light. I do a mitzvah, I'm trying to bring down that one line of light. I'm trying to infuse that one light with more, recharge it with divine energy, and that should shine down into my reality. So that is one way we connect to God, even post Tzimtzum. Okay. The Kabbalah continues and says, ladies and gentlemen, there's another way you connect to God. Forget about the Kav. Forget about that one line. There's another way. What's the other way? The other way is actually more interesting. The other way is what they call the Reshimu. Reshimu means a trace. So, for example, if you write a letter on a piece of parchment and then you erase it, so the letter is no longer visible, but there's still going to be a trace on a piece of parchment or a piece of paper, and you see there was something here. That's a Reshimu. So Reshimu means if something is present and then you try to remove it, even though you remove most of it, but there's a residue. So there's residue from the infinite light in this world as we know it. Right? It's almost like if you read about the science and you read about the Big Bang, how do they prove the Big Bang theory is because one of the, I think if I understand correctly, one of the great proofs for the Big Bang theory is that there's a certain degree, the amount of radioactivity that's equal throughout the universe, and that's sort of the residue of the energy of the Big Bang. So we don't see the Big Bang, but we see its residue. So similarly, the Kabbalah says 400 years earlier that there's this infinite light of God. So even if God removes the infinite light, but there's still going to be residue. What does it mean that there's going to be residue? What does that mean? Reshima, there's a mark, there's a residue. What does that mean? It means that in the physical reality, or reality that's created in the hollow space, that itself, where does this reality come from? That also comes from God himself. So in other words, the physical reality of the world and the creation that's separate from God is actually, if you think about it, is actually also an expression of God. So that is sort of the residue of the infinite light. I hope this is making sense. I'm going to try to explain it. So when you look at the world, we see a physical creation. We don't see anything holy. I'm going to define holiness as we don't see how this creation is connected to its source. We don't see this world as a ray, as a line that if we follow the line, trace the line all the way back up, we'll get to the infinite light. We don't see that. What do we see? We see concealment. We see just physicality, just something that is finite. So the Kabbalah says 1 minute. The fact that the fact that God could express himself in a finite way existed when the infinite light was there. Think about it for a second. When you say something is infinite, you could mean one or two things. You could mean it's infinite and it must remain infinite, Or you could say it's infinite and it can express itself any way it wants, including the finite. So the latter is how the Kabbalah defines God's infinity. And what we're saying basically is that when you remove the infinite light from the empty space, there's something remains. What remains? Finite reality. Yeah, that finite reality was actually part of the infinite reality, separated, and the residue remains in the finite world, but the residue is also part of the infinite light. In short, the physical world is also an expression of God. So if you want to connect to God, you don't have to go back to the light. You can actually look at the physical world, and the physical world itself is an expression of the infinite light of God. So what we call this is two ways to connect to God. One is the Kab. One is that single line of light that's drawn down into the world. And one is the Reshimu, the trace that was left over. Finite existence is a trace of the infinite light. So if you want to now connect to the infinite light, you have two paths. One path is look for that single ray that is directly connected to the infinite light. Another path is look for the trace, look for the residue. And the residue is finite reality. And finite reality is is a perfect expression, not perfect, is an expression of godliness, just like holiness. And therefore, there are two ways to connect to God. And I'm going to stop here to open the floor for questions because we put out too many Kabbalistic concepts, but we didn't get anywhere. Now we have to figure out what this means in our life and how these two interact and how really all of Judaism is a merging of these two concepts. So if you don't fully understand it, that's okay, because the puzzle is not yet complete. But even though the puzzle is not yet complete, I'm going to open it up in case anybody wants to say anything or ask a question, just to make sure we're on the same page, talking the same language. Here we go.
Let's see if Beth asks them a question.
She's going to ask. Oh, no. Hi, Dad. Mute your mic if you're not going to say anything.
There she is.
Sorry, Rabbi. That's my dad and mom.
Beautiful.
Okay.
Okay.
Rabbi?
Yes.
A question. So one would seem to be of direct spirituality, like the two sons of Aaron wanting to take that bride, and the other is to find the God within everybody that you're part of God. So there's really, it seems to be a more approved path in Judaism. Am I right or wrong?
Which one is more approved?
The one of this world.
Nadav ben Avihu is the extreme. I'll say very simple. There's two ways you can talk to God. One is you go do a mitzvah, and one is you take a stroll at the beach and you see nature. You go to the Autobahn. Okay, two ways. Which way brings you closer to God? So it depends what you mean. If you want to say what feels closer to something spiritual, there's no question that a mitzvah, fasting on Yom Kippur, eating matzah on Passover, has the potential to make you feel more directly connected to God. When you go to the Autobahn, you see a tree, it doesn't necessarily, you may be in awe, but it's more of a leap to connect you back to God. But the Judaism says, but the Kabbalah emphasizes this, the power of something finite to be created, the power of a tree to be created is the residue of the infinite light. And in fact, in some sense, you could be just as connected to God when we're looking at nature as when you're studying the Talmud. Don't tell anybody I told you that. But in some sense, that's what we're saying. There's two ways to connect to God.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes. So Barry wants to know, a mitzvah is the best way to connect to the ray of light that comes back into this world. And again, ray of light means the concept of connecting, feeling spiritual, feeling connected to your source. When I look at nature, I feel inspired and I feel invigorated, but I don't necessarily feel connected to my divine source unless I have some meditation involved. But the Kabbalah says it's true. There is a residue. It's not as obvious, but that too, the physical reality itself is also a way of connecting to the infinite God. Okay, so far so good. Now we're going to the next step.
Rabbi, may I ask you a question?
Yes, of course.
All right, my question is this. is it something more than the action itself? In other words, if I look at a tree with reverence versus saying a prayer just as a ritual, and I don't even think about connecting to God, I just think about going through the motions, isn't the experience with the tree more profound?
Yes. Yes and no. Yes, in the sense it's more inspiring to you. Yes, it is. But let's take the perspective of the mystic. Let's forget about our perspective for a second. From the perspective of the mystic, when you're going to do a mitzvah, regardless if you feel it or not, regardless if you're inspired, regardless if you can sense this, every time you do a mitzvah, you are actually creating a flow of energy from God into this world. You are intensifying that single line, a scepter of a string of light coming into this world, regardless if you feel it. The same Kabbalist will tell you, when you go take a stroll on the beach, you're connecting to the residue of the infinite light. But you're not necessarily affecting any change. You're just connecting to that residue. You're connecting to God, but you're not increasing the holiness in the world. So that's the perspective of the Kabbalist. Now, I understand that our perspective is different. Sometimes we could relate to the world differently. Sometimes we do a mitzvah. We don't necessarily experience how meaningful it is. So we, from our subjective perspective, it could be we don't always feel it. But for now, we'll discuss from the perspective of the Kabbalist. Every time you're doing a mitzvah, you're actually increasing light in the world. Every time you connect to something physical, you have the potential to connect to God because you're touching in your hand the residue of the infinite light. If you're touching a chair or an iPhone or an apple or a bagel, what is this? It's something physical. Where does it stem from? It's the residue of the infinite light. Am I increasing any light? No. Could this have the potential to connect me to God? Answer is yes.
Rabbi, a quick question.
Yes.
Is there a difference in mitzvahs if you observe the laws of Pesach completely, 7, 8 days, or if you donate something to a charity or poor person at this time of the world?
Every mitzvah adds the light. Every mitzvah, the purpose of every mitzvah is to bring more of the light, of the infinite light into this world. There are 613 ways of doing it. Today we have less because we don't have a temple. But every mitzvah is an opportunity from this mystical perspective to bring more divine light into this world. It's not just one class of mitzvah, every mitzvah. Yes, so if you help the old lady cross the street, you are bringing more infinite light into this world.
Thank you.
Rabbi, does it work in the other direction as well? If you sin or certain events create less light?
Yeah, it does work in the negative as well. I just don't like to focus on the negative, but it does work in the negative as well. But sin sin causes the light to go back to its source, and the way it happens is because it breaks the vessel. Kabbalistically, I don't want to go into this too deeply, but the point is this: if you have a vessel that's not functioning, the energy will go back to its source. So if you have a machine that's not functioning, the electricity is not going to be able to express itself. So from the Kabbalistic perspective, if I sin, if I do a destructive act in this world, okay, I burn down somebody's house, I hurt somebody, whatever the case is, if I'm doing a destructive act in this world, from the Kabbalistic perspective, I am shattering vessels, I'm breaking a vessel. If I break the vessel, the light escapes back to its source. That's the short answer.
Andy, you don't have to worry about that.
That's correct.
I'm not sure about that.
That's correct. Okay, let's continue a little bit, and maybe we can see what's let's continue a little bit. Okay, let's see what's happening. So I'm going to mute everybody, and if you want to say something, now is your last chance. Okay, here we go. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's do a little Kabbalah. Kabbalah is, you have to be careful when you study Kabbalah because there's a lot of metaphors, and the metaphors, the number one caveat of studying Kabbalah is you have to take the metaphors as non-literal. So we're going to try to do that, and we're going to try to be a little careful of the pitfalls of taking this too literal, but still we have to do this. So in the Kabbalah, everything in this world, at least in the Kabbalah Arizal, everything all of life and all of holiness is really about the union of male and female. They call it in different words in different places, but for example, there are Kabbalistic customs that say this every single day before any mitzvah. They say this prayer. Chabad doesn't do it before every mitzvah. They only do it once a day in the morning before Baruch She'amar in the prayer. If you have a Chabad prayer book, it's on page 30. And the weekday on Shabbat, I forget which page number it is, but it says something as follows. This mitzvah, l'shem yichud, is for the sake of the unity of the Kudsha Brichu U'Shchinte. It's the unity between the Holy One, blessed be He, and His divine presence. Now, it's not supposed to make sense. It's just Kabbalistic lingo. No, I'm kidding. It is supposed to make sense. But really what they're saying is that there's the Holy One, blessed be He, and there is His divine presence, and somehow they're separated, and somehow we have to, when we do a mitzvah, we actually create the union and the marriage between the Holy One, blessed be He, and His Shekhinah and His divine presence. Now, if this made sense to you, that's a problem. It's not supposed to make sense yet. But here we go. So let's think about this. So this is just an example where everything in the Kabbalah is male and female, and the purpose of creation is really to unite the male and the female. So just if you want to talk in broad terms, this is thank you, Mark, page 30. Yeah, in broad terms, even before you go to the Kabbalah, the Medrash says, and other places, the Song of Songs is written as a form of a marriage between bride and groom, which is a metaphor for the God and the Jewish people. You have male, God, the people, female, and we're trying to create a union. And like any relationship, there's ups and downs, and it's always complicated. And if you read more about the complicated romance between God and the Jewish people, open the book of Song of Songs, and it's a complicated romantic book. I'm not going to say romantic comedy, but even though there's some comedy there, but it's a complicated story. So, but again, our relationship with God has a male-female relationship. The Kabbalah takes it even further. Within God, there's masculine aspects and feminine aspects, and our job is to unify the masculine aspects and feminine aspects of God. I know this sounds crazy, but you got to bear with me. One of the ways of unifying the masculine and feminine aspects of God is through a physical marriage. It's not the only way, but it's one way. Okay. So let's think about masculine and feminine for a moment. What does it mean that there's a masculine element of God, and what does it mean that there's a feminine element of God? Now here, I have to be careful. I caution you, I don't want to trigger anybody, but this may not be politically correct. So I'm going to talk in the language of the Kabbalah, and if I offend anybody on the way, I apologize in advance, and hopefully after we could clarify and make everybody feel well and happy. That's one introduction. Second introduction, and this is a very important one. When the Kabbalah says when the Kabbalah says masculine and feminine, it doesn't necessarily translate as male and female. In other words, that a male, someone who's biologically male, is connected to the masculine energy, and someone who's a biological female is connected to the feminine energy. It's much more complicated than that, because every person has both, and because we have 10 sfirot, and some sfirot are masculine and some sfirot are feminine. And with that, different people, there's different sfirot are dominant. And just to put it out there from the Kabbalistic perspectives, most of the souls that we know in this world, most of the souls are what they call neshamot of ban, which is female neshamot. So you have to take, when we talk about masculine and feminine, you have to separate it a little bit from male and female, from biological male and biological female, because it doesn't necessarily overlap in that same way. Everybody has both, is what I'm trying to say. Okay, fine. With those two introductions, we could try to proceed, and hopefully we won't step on any landmines. Here we go. What is the male energy and what is the female energy? So I don't want to offend the males or the females, but here I'm going to try. The male definition, the male energy is one that seeks to dominate. The Talmud says, "Ha'ish darko lichbosh," a man wants to conquer. So the male wants to dominate. What does dominate mean? Dominate means he wants to give. If you ever had a problem and you ever asked a male for the problem, it's a big problem. Many women don't like this. They go to the man and say, "I have a problem," and you talk to the man and you tell him your problem. And what does the man always try to do? I'm sure there's a lot of marriage jokes on this. I'm not so good at the jokes, but this is reality. As soon as you have a problem, you come to your husband and you say, I have a problem at work. The first thing the man is going to do is going to try to solve your problem, right? He's going to say, this is exactly what you should do. Here's your 3-step solution. And if this doesn't work, I have a backup for you, and it's all going to be fine. Now, here's the solution. The problem is that often the person asking for the question is not looking for a solution, is looking for an emotional connection. So that creates a lot of tension. And the men can't figure out why the women are getting upset, because here, you had a problem. I solved your problem. Let's move on to the next issue. Because men want to give in the sense they want to conquer. They want to conquer the problem. So the masculine energy is to give, to conquer, to accomplish, sometimes it's also to break, meaning to break means to superimpose their will. Right? My child doesn't want to do this. My child wants to do one thing. I have my will. I want to educate him. I want to superimpose my will upon him. That's the masculine energy. What's the feminine energy? The feminine energy is a little bit different. Feminine energy is, instead of to conquer or to give or to dominate, the feminine energy from the perspective of the Kabbalah is to cultivate. What does it mean to cultivate? Instead of me superimposing my view on you, if you come to me with a problem, I help you discover how you have the potential to solve your own problem. You have a potential to discover the answer to your question. In other words, I sense that the feminine energy is very nurturing. I sense that you have the potential to overcome the problem. It's my job to help you get in touch with yourself and discover the answer from within yourself. So in that sense, it's not a question of conquest. It's a question of cultivating and finding this within yourself. So if you're still here and I didn't offend you, and if you're still here, you understand that there's 2 ways to solve a problem. I could superimpose my will, or I could help that other person realize that the answer, they have their answer within themselves, and help them discover it on their own. Okay. How does this help us with the whole concept of the Kav and the Reshima, which means the light that's drawn down in the world every time we do a mitzvah? That's one form of connecting to the divine. And then there is the energy that a person finds, and then there's the energy, the residue. The physical world itself is a residue of the infinite light. Without doing any mitzvot, you can actually find the holiness within the physical world by itself, because the physical world is really just an expression, a residue of the infinite light of God. How does this relate? So the answer is that the ray of light is masculine. What do I mean it's masculine? It wants to superimpose holiness into the world, right? So from the perspective of the ray of light, the world is an empty space. There is no holiness. There is just physical reality, which is separate and disconnected from God. And my job is to bring more light into the world. So I'm superimposing light into a place of darkness. That's the perspective of the ray. That's the perspective of the person doing the mitzvah. If I do a mitzvah, I mean breakfast is unholy. When I go to take the energy and study Torah, now I'm bringing the light, superimposing the light into the darkness. That's the kav. That's the ray. What is the Reshima? Reshima tells you, the residue tells you, the residue or the mark left over from the infinite light tells you no. When you look at finite reality, you don't have to superimpose light from outside. If you actually drill to its core and you ask yourself, what is finite reality? What is the physical world? What is limitation? What is concealment? You say, this is the residue of the infinite light. This is an expression of the infinite light's ability to express itself in a finite way. If I realize that, that's feminine. What do I mean it's feminine? I'm not superimposing light onto it. I'm discovering how it itself is connected to God. The physical world itself has a divine source without superimposing light from the outside. That's the feminine aspect. What's the marriage of the masculine and feminine? If you look at all the Midrashim and all the Jewish literature, they say when Mashiach comes and when at the end of days, you'll have a marriage between God and the Jewish people. Because at Sinai, it was only a betrothal, and the actual consummation of the marriage will happen at the end of days. What does that mean? It means when the light that comes from above, the masculine energy, touches the feminine aspect and they unite, that's the marriage. When we have both in our life, when we can bring light, masculine light into the world, And we can also, that helps us, sometimes you have to do the mitzvah. When you connect to the light helps you discover that the residue, that the darkness is actually a residue of the infinite light. In other words, if I don't do any mitzvah, it's very hard for me to feel connected to God when I take a stroll in nature. But if I do a mitzvah, I have the light, I have the masculine energy, that allows me to experience the feminine energy within the world. And if I can have both of these into my life, that's the marriage of the masculine and the feminine. And that is both aspects of the Tzimtsum who are going to reunite in marriage. Now, to add a dimension, we're not going to get there right now, but when we discuss the birth of male and female in the Torah, you see that male and female were really one, then they're separate, then they're reunited. Okay? Now, the ray and the residue were one. After the Tzimtzum, they separate, and through our divine service, they reunite. So the same pattern emerges. So what am I saying? I'm saying that there's two ways to connect to God. One is the more masculine, one's the more feminine. Both are important. If you can have both in your life, that's a healthy union between male and female, and that helps bring about the union between the masculine energies of God and the feminine energies of God. That's one dimension. Just to bring that full circle, this is not a Hasidic commentary. We discussed the third word of the Torah. In the beginning, God created, and then what do we have? Heaven and earth. Et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. What does it mean, heaven and earth? It's not so clear, because the heaven is not discussed till day 2. Earth is not discussed till day 3. So what does it mean, heaven and earth, in verse 1? In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. So there are all kinds of interpretations. We don't have time to cover all of them today. But just to say one that lines up with the Hasidic commentary. So one interpretation of heaven and earth, heaven is the mashpia, heaven is the giver, because we get our sustenance from the heaven. We get rain, we get light, we get energy, everything we have, we get from the heaven. And earth is the feminine, earth is the recipient. So if you have masculine and feminine, giver and recipient, that is baked into the first verse of the Torah. In the beginning, God creates a process where there's concealment, there's Elohim, there's Tzimtzum, and following the Tzimtzum, you have Hashamayim, you have masculine energy, that's the ray of light, and then you have Aretz, you have earthly energy, that's the feminine energy, that's the residue, and you realize that the earth itself is also an expression of the infinite light of God. So that first verse, according to the Kabbalah, really captures the entire story of creation. Not just the past, but also the future, because the future is about merging. Can we bring the masculine energy and the feminine energy together and produce a healthy marriage? And when we do that, then the spiritual side of life and the physical side of life are no longer in conflict. Rather, they are in a harmonious relationship. It's like you have a male energy and a female energy. They could clash, they could be at war, but they can also live in harmony. And when we bridge the masculine energy and the feminine energy, and the way we're discussing it now, the idea that the light of God which seeks to dominate, which means sees the world as opposition, sees the world as darkness, and wants to superimpose itself on the world, that's the masculine. And the feminine is the ability to see the world and understand and nurture it to the point where even without bringing in external light from God, the physicality, the finiteness of the world itself is an expression of the infinite light. So I apologize a little for talking too much Kabbalah so early in the morning, so early in the week, but we'll open it up for questions, and then we'll see if we can continue on our journey. Here we go. Okay,
Yeah.
if anybody wants to jump in.
Can you hear me, Rabbi?
Yes.
All right, my question is this. Is the assumption that all of us have both of these qualities within us, the masculine and the feminine, the will to dominate at the capacity, the will to cultivate at the capacity, and is the assumption that we should both work on both of these traits in ourselves, or if perhaps we're deficient in one, then that points to the area that we need to work on?
The answer is yes. The answer is we both have both elements, and if we'll have time one day, we'll discuss the 10 sfirot, and we'll talk about how some sfirot, some of the attributes are more masculine, some are more feminine, some are givers, some are recipients, and they each have a role to play. Now, when I say recipient, it's not so simple that the recipient is a recipient. That's another story. Sometimes the recipient actually produces more than the giver. So if you go back to the biology and you talk about the process of procreation, for example. So the male gives seed, the woman receives the seed. But it's not fair to say that the woman, the recipient, is not creating. In fact, the woman is the one who creates the seed and allows it to become into a fetus. So make no mistake, the division between giver and recipient is not as simple as it looks. Sometimes sometimes the recipient does more than the giver, but that's another story. Just like the person who wants to dominate doesn't always get his way, and sometimes the person who wants to cultivate is in fact the one who actually gets farther. So again, we're just touching we're just getting our toes wet. There's a whole body of knowledge here. So, but hopefully this will at least awaken our interest, and we can further investigate and continue the process of study.
Rabbi?
Yes.
I'm always struck by Isha's Kyle, that really is an expression of both sides.
Yes.
The woman who girds her loins, but she's also cultivating.
Yeah, that's what I said. And both have to, like I said, we're talking about a woman. A woman is not does not line up necessarily with the Kabbalistic definition of only a recipient, right? I would say the feminine aspect of woman is the recipient. But to survive in this world, everybody has to have both elements. And therefore, if you read the Eshet Chayil, she's wisdom, she's expressing, she's going out to business, she's riding the ships, etc., etc.
Question, Rabbi.
Yes.
So the verse says that heavens is plural. So that being the case, where exactly would Gan Eden be?
So it's a question what heaven means in verse 1. It's also a question what heaven means in the second day of creation. So the short answer is I don't know. But one idea of being plural is that heavens include everything beyond earth. The word shamayim has different meanings. One meaning of shamayim is, it's two words. Sham, which means there. There means the distance. And then the yud mem, right? So shamayim is sham, and then yud mem. Yud mem is what makes something plural. So if you have a yad, you have yadayim. You have regel, you have raglayim. So in other words, shamayim is there, the distance, and it's plural, meaning to say there's many levels of this vast distance that we don't know exactly what it contains, that is called shamayim. So the short answer is shamayim is the most general term that we can find to discuss all the unknown beyond the earth.
Isn't there also a connection with Shemayim and water?
Rashi says Shemayim is Eish and Mayim, fire and water. These are the two extremes necessary to create the heavens. So we'll hopefully elaborate upon that next week. But there are so many definitions, again, because everybody understands that verse 1 has to be very general, and the more inclusive, the better, because the specifics of creation, we didn't touch upon the specifics of creation yet. Even light wasn't even created yet. So it's not so clear what heaven and earth means. So that's why many of the commentators say heaven and earth has to be understood in the broadest sense and in the most abstract sense. And that was one example where heaven and earth is the masculine aspect of God, the giver and the recipient, because those concepts actually creation. That within God, there's heaven and earth. Within God, there's giver and recipient.
Zoom on my iPad, so I can...
Even post the Tzimtsum, there's the kav, there's the one line of light, which is masculine, and there's the residue, which is feminine.
See what she said.
Where you could go on your...
Okay, so that's for that. If this made sense to you, then you're good, you're a Kabbalist. If it didn't, that's okay. And either ask the question or we'll elaborate or ask me offline. And there's a lot to discuss and a lot to learn, but this is certainly fascinating stuff.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
I was watching a television show, and there's a question about there was possibly no Big Bang, and that there was a kind of origin that creates multiverses. Does that in any way change this metaphor?
Well, we definitely, I already said it last week, I said that people think Big Bang is anti-creation and anti-religion. To the contrary, Big Bang is actually very much in line with religion, with Torah, because Big Bang proved that there was a Big Bang speculates that there was a beginning. And we're very much into beginning. If there was no beginning, that's problematic from our perspective.
Okay, so that's the argument, Rabbi, that there was not a Big Bang, that the scientists are questioning that
Yeah.
there was no beginning as we understand beginning, that there were sort of multiverses that on television look like a bunch of bubbles being
Correct. And
constantly
as far as I
created.
know, again, I'm not an expert in physics or in cosmology. As far as I know, these are theories. These are not even theories that are supported by scientific observation. As far as I know, it's just a theory. The Jewish people have walked the lonely path and said that there was a beginning for many, many thousands of years when everybody ridiculed them. Then in the 20th century, we discovered that indeed there was a beginning. And then we had some company in our journey of understanding that there was a beginning. So if for temporarily the science departs, it won't be the first time that the science departs. I'm absolutely certain that the science will return and meet up with the Torah again. But in the meantime, rest assured that as far as I know, not that I'm a great scholar, but as far as I know, the concepts of no beginning is actually theory, and it's unknown, and it cannot be known. Nobody could know. All the great physicists say what happened at the moment of the Big Bang. Certainly before that is impossible to know. There's no knowledge. So all the scientific fact, all the scientific evidence now leads us and points to a direction of a beginning. There are other scientific theories, but that's not the most common theory.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Carl Jung believed in the yin and the yang within everybody, the male and the female. So
Yes.
that's the Kabbalistic theory.
Absolutely. Kabbalistic, for certain, once you go back to the Arizal, everything is about connecting the masculine and feminine within God, within the person, within the universe. Indeed. Again, I'm just touching on the surface within the Kabbalah. There's so much about. I would say it's probably the most common theme is the unity between the male and the female. Okay, I'm going to try. We have a few minutes left, right? What is the clock saying now? We have a few minutes left. I'm going to try to jump to bring in another topic, but it's not going to be completely unrelated. Ultimately, it's going to connect to these two concepts of the kav, the light of holiness that's drawn down into the empty space, and the Reshima, the residue. In simple English, we call one spirituality and physical, or you can call one holiness and unholiness, but you get the picture. So I'm just going to put it out there. There's a strange dispute between Hillel and Shammai on this verse and verse 1, right? You could understand that Hillel and Shammai, who love to argue, also argued about the first verse. I should be more accurate. It's not Hillel and Shammai, but it's the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai, the yeshiva of Hillel and the yeshiva of Shammai. They argue about verse number 1. And I'm going to tell you the argument, and it's actually a pretty strange argument, but once we're going to give the Hasidic and Kabbalistic interpretation, hopefully it will make a little bit more sense. So here's the argument. If I take a vote of members of this call, this esteemed group, and I say, what was created first, heaven or earth? What would you answer?
Mine.
I'm sorry?
Yes.
Heaven.
Heaven, of course. And you have, I didn't mute everybody. That's good. By divine providence, I didn't mute everybody. Good. So I think I got heaven. So it was created first, heaven or earth. Everyone tells me heaven. If I ask you to bring biblical support, let me just mute everybody so we get some, I can hear myself. If I ask you to please give me biblical support to your thesis that heaven was created first, what would you tell me? You would tell me, look no further than Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. Right? In the beginning, God created heaven and earth. So it says heaven before earth. So presumably heaven precedes earth, right? What could be more simple than that? We don't know much about this verse, but we know that heaven appears first in this verse. Everything is fine and everything is dandy. Heaven was created first. That's what it seems. But like everything else in Judaism, it's actually much more complicated than that. Let me find the verse that complicates matters. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the opinion of Shammai. So if you believe heaven was created first, you're in very good company. Shammai says heaven was created first. However, Hillel says no, it's impossible. Heaven wasn't created first. Earth was created first. How was earth created first? Like, where do you get that from? So I don't know if you have a book, but I'll read it to you. If you look at Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, it says, these are the chronicles of the heaven and the earth when they were created, in the day that Hashem Elohim, that God created earth and heaven, Eretz v'shamayim, Genesis chapter 2, verse 4, says, Hillel, you know something? Earth must have been created first. How do I know? Because the verse says, the day that God, that Hashem Elohim, the Lord God, created earth and heaven, the order is reversed. Earth is before heaven. So Hillel says, earth precedes heaven. Okay, how exactly are we supposed to make sense of this disagreement? Are they really arguing? Why does the Torah make both? Why does the Torah explain? Make this change? One verse it says heaven first, which will lead us to believe like Shammai that heaven is created first, and then we have the perspective of Hillel where earth is created first. How does this relate to Shammai and Hillel's perspective in general, where Shammai is always more strict and Hillel is more lenient? And how do we make sense of all of this? So I'm going to try to give a brief interpretation. I think I have about 3 minutes left, so hopefully I'll be able to conclude. And just to put it out there, from the Hasidic perspective, this is actually a fascinating argument. It's not a question of what's created first. It's not talking about chronology, what's created first. The question is, when you say what's created first, you mean, what is the goal? What's the purpose of creation? Shammai says, purpose of creation is to get to heaven. Now, it doesn't mean get to heaven, mean go and die, because God created the earth, God wants you to be here. But from Shammai's perspective, the purpose of life is to have more and more moments of heaven. Connect to spirituality, that's the purpose of life. So of course you're in the physical world, of course you have to survive, but the purpose is heaven. Hillel says, what's created first? What's more prominent? What's the goal? Not heaven, but earth. Purpose of the mitzvah is sanctify the earth, not to feel closer to spirituality necessarily. And this is a very deep argument. And it also relates to the fact that Shammai is very comfortable being strict. Because what does strict mean? Strict means that you say, is this experience holy? Is it kosher? Can I use this in my service of God? Will this experience, can I cultivate this experience in my spiritual pursuit? Shammai is very happy to say no. If in doubt, don't engage in this. Because Shammai is very happy to separate from the physical world. So you just engage in the world as much as you have to. You have to eat breakfast, you have to eat vegetables, you're allowed to engage in things that are absolutely certain kosher. And those are the experiences that you can engage in. But the purpose is actually not to elevate as much as possible. The purpose is to elevate yourself and try to escape heaven, earth as much as possible. So you have to live on earth. You're sort of a ladder between heaven and earth. But the closer you can be to heaven, the better off you are. What does Hillel say? Hillel says, of course, you're a ladder between heaven and earth. You're a hybrid of a spiritual entity and a physical entity. But God wants you to do a mitzvah. What's the purpose of the mitzvah? Purpose of the mitzvah is not necessarily to make you more spiritual. The purpose of the mitzvah is to tap into the physicality of the world and make the physical reality more connected to God. So you're not going upward, you're going downward. Down here is where all the action and all the drama is. And therefore, Hillel, when in doubt, says the thing is kosher. Hillel's trying to be more inclusive. Not because he's more or less careful about the law and cares less about holiness. To the contrary, what he's trying to do is try to expand the domain of holiness to cover more and more of the physical reality. And this we can elaborate upon this for a long time to explain how this really relates to Shammai and Hillel and what this really means. But just to come full circle, Shammai is in love with the scepter of light, that line of light, the kav, the obvious expression of holiness that's coming down from the infinite light and coming down into this world. So Shammai is seeking to feel spiritual. So Shammai is saying, let's feel holy. Let's feel holy. Let's disengage from earth as much as possible, and let's connect to heaven as much as possible. I don't mean blow ourselves up and go to heaven. I mean, in this world, devote more and more time and energy, and the goal is actually to be more spiritual, to be removed. Hillel says that's more of the male perspective, and that's why Shammai is more strict. Hillel is more feminine. Hillel is saying, if you could realize that more and more of the domain of the world is kosher, if you could realize that the world itself is not necessarily an obstacle to holiness, but the world itself is actually a vehicle that connects you to God, then you're perfectly happy to realize that the earth is actually the goal. And therefore, earth was created first, meaning to say earth is the ultimate place where God wants to be, and the earth has a superiority over heaven, meaning to say the residue of the infinite light has a certain superiority over the single line of light that's going to enter the world. Or in simple English, the feminine aspect has superiority over the masculine aspect. Now, we put a lot out there today, a lot to unpack, but I feel like it's the beginning of the Torah. There's a lot of mysticism. We have to put it out there, and hopefully over the next 10 or 20 or 30 years, we can unpack this as we go through the study of Torah in our round number 2. Round 1 took us only 12 years, but we're projecting that round 2 should take us a little bit more. So God should give us good health and long life so we can actually study the Torah and do everything we need to do. So I'm going to open up the floor for comments. Everybody could say hello, good morning, or if you have a question or you have a comment, or if you think what I said is too controversial or not controversial enough, whatever you like, here's the place to share.
Rabbi, it's Warren. I do have a question. What is the relationship between heaven, in the way that you were just talking about it, and the place where God concealed himself, if that makes sense, Tzimtsum? Is heaven where God concealed himself, or is that?
So we're saying no. We're saying heaven is the light. Heaven is the light. The concealment is Elok. Oh, okay. So the question. Okay. So let's think about this for a second. Let's read the Kabbalah literally. We're not supposed to do it. We have to read it literally and then think about it abstractly. But before we can think about it abstractly, we have to think about it literally. So if you want to just take the metaphor of the Arizal's metaphor is there's infinite light everywhere. There's a round, empty space that God contracts himself, moves his infinite light out of that space. Now where can infinite light be found? Infinite light can be found outside that circle, right? So there's a circle, a hollow space, a circle of reality where you don't see the infinite light, but the rest of the infinite light is sort of outside that circle, all around that circle. Now we have a limited ray that will come into this world. Now, from the Kabbalistic perspective, the answer to your question is that heaven could be both. And if you read the Zohar, for example, every page of the Zohar talks about there's the encompassing light, or hasovev, the encompassing light, and then there's mimale, the light that is imminent and the light that fills every creation. And in a sense, what's happening here is the light that the encompassing light, sovev, is now the infinite light that's outside this empty space, and the limit and the imminent light, the light that fills each creation, is that one line that's drawn in. But both could be considered heaven. That's the answer to your question, I think. And that's why in the Hebrew, the grammar of the Hebrew, I think I alluded to it earlier, the grammar of the Hebrew is shamayim is by definition plural, because there are multiple dimensions of heaven. Right? So the construct of the word, a word in Hebrew that concludes with yud mem, means that it's plural. So the Torah is hinting to you that when you say heaven, you say there's abstraction, you say there are things above the physical, there are multiple dimensions to that. So I hope this helps a little bit.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Rabbi, can I ask one question about the residue, the light that's coming from the residue? So my question is,
it's not light. Hang
oh,
on,
I'm sorry. You're right. Yeah, I'm sorry. So that residue, what is it that keeps everything in existence? Is it the residue that's giving it energy, or is it the kav that's giving it its energy? Like
the kav is giving its energy, but the residue gives it existence. In other words, where do you get a concept that something could be finite? Finite, I mean concealment. Where could there be in this world? What's the source of something that's finite and concealment? It cannot be the kav. It cannot be the line of light that's drawn down into the world. Because the one property of light is light always is connected to its source. If you go outside, I'm sitting in my room, and there's a ray of light here in my room. What I know is that there's no obstruction between the ray of light and the sun. I know there's no cloud blocking that ray from hitting my window. So light, by definition, is something that's connected to its source. So if I look outside, if I'm sitting on my table and I'm holding a mug, and the mug, I don't see this connected to spirituality. So what's the source of this mug? Does it come from the light? No. Light is something that is obviously connected to its source. So a mitzvah is light. The mitzvah is connected to its source. So where does this come from? So what gives it energy, what allows it to exist, is the light. But the finiteness of this creation, the concept that something here could conceal the light, that comes from the residue. What is the residue? The residue is the power. Remember, you had infinite light here. Included in the power of infinity is the power to hide. And when you move the infinite light, what are you left with? The power to hide. That's what we call Reshima. That's what we call residue. So now, if you want a trick question, what's higher, the Reshima or the Kav? It's not so simple. It's not so simple.
So we're saying then that 100% of everything, the physical and the spiritual energy of everything is divine.
Very good. Yeah, absolutely. And that's why it's not obviously divine, but it is divine, but not obviously divine. That's why we don't call it holy. Holy, you mean that the connected, the divine energy is transparent. It's revealed. Physical means the divine power. The divine power is concealed. But just because it's concealed, we say the power to conceal is the residue of the infinite light. If you're talking to a physicist, you say, look, there's residue of the Big Bang everywhere. Not only is it everywhere, but it's everywhere equally. With the radiation left over, because there's a certain thing that even if you move the actual light, the residue will be distributed equally everywhere. And that's exactly what happens. The residue of the infinite light, the power of finiteness, is everywhere all the time.
Rabbi, would you describe the patriarchs as combining the two sources?
I think all of Torah, all of life is if you could try to bridge the two, the masculine and the feminine, the obvious light and the concealment, and show that they're one. There's a Hasidic interpretation that the Rebbe said in the first night when he officially accepted the leadership of Chabad. So this is a well-known Hasidic concept, but something the Rebbe repeated, so almost like his mission statements. And he said that if you look at Abraham, the verse says, Vayikra Sham, Abraham called out the name of God. I'm sorry, B'Shem Hashem, in the name of God, the God world. There's a grammatic problem. It doesn't say the God of the world, which would imply that God and world are two separate entities. But Abraham says, God, world. World itself is an expression of God. World itself is not disconnected from God. So this is something that this is the sort of the tension and the balance that Judaism is all about. The masculine energy, the feminine energy. The masculine wants obvious light to dominate, and the feminine energy says you don't have to dominate reality with obvious light. You have to realize that even the concealment is an expression of the infinite light of God. That's much longer. It's a deeper path. But ultimately, that's the goal. Ultimately, the goal is to marry both.
Thank you.
Rabbi.
Yes.
So in a prayer, it says, we say, sanctify your name in your universe.
Correct.
And it's up to us to, after we pray for that we think about, what we're going to do.
Correct.
And I'm asking, isn't that the only way? And then you think about, are you going to use a feminine energy in a situation? Or are you going to use a masculine energy in a situation? Isn't that the only way to be able to do what you're talking about?
Yes, I think when you say we ask that God sanctify his name, these are all terms that imply revelation. We want that God's reality should be revealed in the world. To do so, we have to do things that are obviously connected to their source. In simple English, we have to do a mitzvah. So you're referring to the feminine, the masculine aspect of God. In other words, a masculine aspect, which is, can you bring light into the world? Once you bring light into the world, the catch is, once you brought God's glory into the world, now you discover that the world itself actually was never disconnected to begin with. So that's a deeper recognition, but it can only happen after you bring the light in the world. Once you have
bringing light into the world is both a feminine choice, a choice of feminine and masculine, depending on the situation a person uses. It doesn't matter whether we're a man or a woman.
Correct.
You use the correct energy. I'm asking, isn't this the only way to do it, to bring the correct energy into the situation that God has created?
So the short answer is that there's